Hello friends! Blend modes in Procreate can be confusing to understand and really technical. So rather than combing through the technical details of how they work, we're going to explore how different blend modes can change the way your art looks. In this video, we're going to see how we can use blend modes to add highlights to an illustration. In a nutshell, blend modes are effects that determine how two or more layers interact. This drawing is going to be my base layer, and I'm going to create a new layer above it, and this new layer will be my blend layer. When you add a blend mode to this top layer, you can manipulate the look of your drawing without making any changes to the base layer. So that means that blend modes are a non-destructive way to alter your artwork. At the time of this recording, I'm using Procreate version 5.4, and the blend modes cover 5 basic categories: darken, lighten, contrast, inversion, and color. I will test each category in a separate video. In this video, we're going to experiment with the lighten category, which includes the blend modes lighten, screen, color dodge, add, and lighter color. I'm going to add highlights to this drawing using each of the lighten blend modes, and we'll see how they affect the artwork. Before we continue, I'd love if you'd like, comment, subscribe, and watch till the very end because it really helps the channel. Okay, I'm working on the blend layer, and I'm going to add a stripe in white. Then I'm going to use a mid-tone color, so I'm using the same blue as the background. And then I'll add a third stripe in a really bright color. Now let's see how these stripes will interact with the base layer. First, I'm going to switch the blend mode on this layer to lighten. So the white stripe remains solid, so there's no color interaction happening there. Now, as I mentioned, the blue stripe and the background are the same color. So when the two blues overlap, the color does get lighter. But when that blue overlaps the orange, we're getting this interesting pink color. Then here with the bright green stripe, the orange areas get much lighter and they're actually quite blown out because the details and value shifting here gets lost. I didn't mention this in my last video, but you can shift the look of the blend mode by adjusting the opacity on the blend layer. So if I reduce the opacity a bit, you can see that more color interaction starts to happen with the white stripe. Of course, you can now see through that stripe because we've dropped the opacity down. But here on the orange areas, it's also giving this kind of pink tint. With the opacity drop down, the blue stripe completely disappears into the background color, but you do still see that pink tint here. And the effect of the green stripe gets much more subtle. It actually kind of disappears here on the orange areas. But you can still see it in this area where the orange is a lot darker. All right, let's add some actual highlights to this drawing. So I'm going to turn the opacity back up on that layer and turn it off for now. Then I'm going to create a new layer right above the base layer. And this will be my blend layer for the highlights. On this new layer, I'm going to change the blend mode to lighten. The brush I'm using is called Molesworth, which is from the charcoal set in the Procreate library. So it's not very solid. There's some grain to it, and there's a decent amount of value shifting with each stroke. Now that detail is important here because remember how the white stripe turned some areas pink when I reduced the opacity? Well, you can see that pink showing up in some areas of these highlights. And that's because this brush naturally has some slightly transparent areas in the stroke. So that detail is giving these highlights an interesting glow. Now, if I drop the opacity down on this highlight layer, you can see that the white areas start to disappear and you're mostly seeing that slightly pink tint. Now let's see what happens if I change that highlight color to blue. So it turns pink against all the orange areas, but it does kind of create a slightly lighter blue against the green and here where it shows up against the background ever so slightly. Now, if I change the highlight color to the bright green, it mostly gets lost against the orange areas, And it's only showing up where the orange is darkest. Against the blue, it has a slight tint to it, so it looks more like a yellow than the bright green. So I think for this particular blend mode, using white seems to be most effective. All right, let's turn off the highlights layer for now, go back to the stripes layer, and we're going to change that blend mode to screen. At 100% opacity, again, there's no change with the white stripe. The blue stripe has a similar effect to the previous mode, but the color interaction is a little bit more opaque. The blue in the background areas gets even lighter, but there's a more subtle shift to the pink color here where it overlaps the orange. The bright green stripe also has a similar effect to the last mode, but it's more intense here. The color changes almost to like a fluorescent yellow. Now let's see what the highlights look like. So I'm going to turn off the stripes layer, turn back on the highlight layer, and change that to screen as well. Again, with the white, there's no real interesting color interaction happening. The highlights just look white. And actually, they also look much more solid. So when this was set to the lighten blend mode, you see more of the grain and some areas of the stroke kind of fade into the color on the base layer. But here with the screen blend mode, that white is much more solid and much more prominent. You can see that shift there. And you're seeing less of the grain in the brush as well. Let's see, if I change the color of the highlights to the blue, now things get slightly more interesting. You can see that kind of pink tint where the highlight hits the orange areas, especially when the orange is a bit darker. And when it's against the green, that same highlight looks a little bit more blue. And same here, when it's against the blue background, that color shifts to a light blue. Now let's see, when I change the highlight color to green, those highlights really stand out because that color tint is so fluorescent. If I reduce the opacity, of course, that tones it down a bit and it's not quite so jarring. Okay, back to the stripes layer, and we're going to change the mode to color dodge. Again, nothing happening with the white stripe, but the blue stripe turns fluorescent against the blue background. And then when it intersects with the other colors, it just goes white as well. You can see a little bit of the dark orange peeking through here, but for the most part, it just goes white. Then the bright green stripe goes to a really intense fluorescent yellow when it interacts with the orange on the base layer, and then it turns white against the blue background. Now let's see what happens when I turn the opacity down. Okay, so that definitely kind of tames that effect quite a bit. And it just brightens up those areas where it's intersecting. All right, let's see what happens on the layer with the highlights. So I'm going to turn that layer back on, switch to color dodge. Now here the highlights are in bright green and they looked intense with the last mode, but they're even more intense here. So this is what it looked like in the screen mode, and color dodge just kind of bumps it up. And actually the color is shifting differently too. Do you see the difference? With color dodge, you can see a little bit of blue here where the color is on top of the blue background. But strangely enough, it's not happening on these areas that are also above the blue. So that's interesting. Let's see what happens when I change that highlight color to blue. All right, so in the areas where the highlight is against the blue background, it gets really vibrant. It turns that kind of fluorescent blue. And everywhere else looks mostly white. Actually, you're seeing quite a bit of shifting here. So you get a little bit of that bright blue, a very, very slight pink in some areas here, then it's shifting back to blue. And all of these other areas are fairly white, but there's a tiny bit of pink in there as well. So that's interesting, but if you drop the opacity down, those blue areas drop back and they're a little bit more subtle. Okay, if I switch the highlight color to white, nothing really happens in terms of color interaction. It just looks like a solid white. Okay, let's go back to the stripes layer. And we're going to switch the blend mode to add. With the opacity at 100%, all three stripes look very similar to the color dodge mode. Let me just switch back and forth so that you can see. So there's really not a big shift happening here. But when you reduce the opacity, it gets a little bit more interesting. With this blend mode, all the colors on the layer below get lighter and brighter, but it's not blowing out all the detail. You're still getting some value shifting happening. It just kind of looks like there's a bright light shining on everything. If we go to the layer with the highlights, I'm going to change that to add as well. And here, the white highlights have a slight halo around them. In some areas, it gets really, really bright and blown out, but then here you're seeing the green and it has kind of a yellow tinge to it. And even when you reduce the opacity, the color shifts to more of a yellow, but the effect is still really intense. And you can see that glow kind of happening as I turn the opacity back up. When I change the highlight color to blue, the tint shifts in some areas. So up here where the highlight is against a blue background, you're getting that super bright blue again, but it's the same level of intensity. Again, you'd need to drop the opacity all the way down to about 20 or 30% for it to look a little less dramatic. When I switch the highlight color to green, it kicks up the intensity even more because now that color shift is much more fluorescent. Let's see, if I play with the opacity, it's still really, really intense. Even if I drop the opacity down to about 17%, it's still pretty vibrant. Okay, to test the last of these lightening blend modes, we're going to go back to the stripes layer. I'm going to set the opacity back up to 100%. And let's switch the blend mode to lighter color. Now this doesn't affect the white stripe at all, but the blue stripe all but disappears when it interacts with the orange. Only a few small specks of blue show up in the darkest areas, but for the most part, it's kind of disappearing against that orange, and it shows up again against the blue background. Now the green stripe is remaining pretty solid, except that it disappears wherever there's a lighter color. So in this mode, it looks like the lighter colors are pushed to the front and the darker colors are hidden. Now let's go to the highlights layer and change that to lighter color as well. Now here the highlights are in green, and again, they're disappearing everywhere except in the areas where the green is the lighter color. So here, the green is lighter than this orange. It's lighter than this green, so it's showing up. But here, the orange is lighter, so the green disappears, and then it reappears here against the darker background. If I change that highlight color to the blue, it doesn't really show up anywhere because most of the colors in this illustration are lighter than the blue. You do see it a little bit here where the blue is a bit lighter than that green. And here where it's a little bit lighter than the background. But other than that, it doesn't work in the blue. And then if I use the white as the highlight color, it's just showing up as a solid white and there's really no interaction with the base layer. So with this particular drawing, I seem to get the best results when I used a mid-tone color for the highlights instead of using a white or a bright color. And I also got the best results when I used the blend modes screen, color dodge, and add. Also, these modes worked the best when I reduced the opacity on the blend layer. Of course, these might all look a little bit different on a different illustration, so it's best to just experiment and see what you can come up with. I really hope you found this helpful. For more Procreate tips and tricks, there's a link to a playlist in the description. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching.